On this episode of the End of Tourism podcast.
Tanri means God in our language, in the original Turkish language, it's Tanri. And misafir means the guest. Anybody coming from somewhere else who comes into somebody's house is allowed to stay in the house as the guest of God, because we believe that God has sent that guest to us, and we try to, it's more like making that guest happy means making God happy. That's the understanding of older generation.
Welcome to the End of Tourism. Conversations on wanderlust, exile, and radical hospitality. A quick reminder that the podcast lives on a gift economy model, which means that anyone, anywhere can listen, regardless of their economic situation. Your gift ensures it stays that way, free of advertisements and members-only paywalls. It allows me to devote a great deal of time to this project, to pay for the software and hardware that makes the podcast possible, as well as all of the production and post-production labor. In order to keep the project fed, you can subscribe by making monthly, annual, or one-time offerings at chrischris2.substack.com, where you'll also have access to my writing on these and other subjects including food culture, psychedelics, media ecology, and myth. You can also support us by leaving a review for the pod on Apple or Spotify, by sharing the episodes with your friends, and by following us on social media via the handle, The End of Tourism. On this episode, my guest is Hasan Kerim Güç. Kerim graduated from Istanbul High School in 1992 and from Yildiz Technical University in 1996. Between 1997 and 2004, Kerim completed his master's degree in Information Systems and Business Administration in Baltimore, USA. He returned to Turkey in 2010, realizing that the treasure he had been looking for 14 years was right in his own home. He took the position of chief editor at Nefes Publishing House in 2014. Kerim nourishes his business life with Sufi Studies and is pursuing a doctoral degree from the Usküdar University Institute for Sufi Studies. Kerim has published 4 books. Welcome to the End of Tourism podcast, Kerim. Hoş geldiniz.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for joining me today. Perhaps you could tell our listeners where you find yourself and what the world looks like there for you.
Well, first of all, I'm an immigrant also. I was an immigrant. I lived in the US for a while, and then I came back to my own country, and things are very different here than it is in US. From the perspective of what I did, I was actually an engineer, and I was working in the IT field, and I was living the American dream. And then I realized that there was some kind of an emptiness in this whole thing. And I decided to go back to Turkey and study Sufism. And since my mother was actually a Sufi teacher, she decided to actually move this whole Sufism into academia. So she basically established an institute in Istanbul, Üsküdar Istanbul, at University of Üsküdar. The difference between this institute and the other schools, the people like myself, like engineers coming from different disciplines, including lawyers and whatnot, they were not able to do their masters or PhDs in Sufism, because in other universities, they require for you to actually have theology backgrounds. But with this new establishment, we were able to educate people from all different disciplines. And so we basically concentrated on ethics rather than the religion itself. So a lot of people coming from different areas, especially the white collar people, living this, like, how do I say that? It's a world of money and materialism and all kind of that stuff. They're coming to our institute and realizing that money or career is not the only goal for life. And we started to concentrating on things like spirituality more than the materialist world.
Thank you. Well, I'm very much looking forward to exploring these themes with you and a little bit of the work that you do with Kerim Vakfi.
Sure.
And so for the last season of the podcast, I'm very much interested in focusing on different hospitality traditions and practices from around the world, as I mentioned to you. And one of the key themes of the podcast is radical hospitality. Now, the word radical comes from Latin, and it means rooted, or we might even say local or living. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious if there are any radical hospitality practices that you think are unique to your place, to Istanbul, mm-hmm. or to the Sufi community that you might be willing to share with us today.
Well, Istanbul actually is a very metropolitan city. So like the other metropolitan cities, we kind of lost that, what we call the hospitality of Anatolia. Anatolia is basically the eastern part of Istanbul. And Istanbul, we have right now 25 million people in a very small area. And in older days, when the population was smaller, we were able to show our hospitality because the Turkish hospitality is very famous, actually. In this area, the hospitality is very famous, including the Greek and Arab hospitality. Usually it's a little bit different than the Western countries. For instance, we welcome people that we used to, probably still in the countryside, the people coming from other cities or countries or whatnot. The locals actually help them out as much as possible. They even invite them to their own houses and let them stay for how long they want to stay. And this was kind of like a regular thing in old days. What's still going on very much in the eastern side of Turkey, pretty much in the countryside. But Istanbul, like other cosmopolitan cities, we kind of lost that. Neighborly things. We have a lot of neighbors, and we have always good. We used to have a lot of good relationship with them, but nowadays, again, because of this material world, we kind of lost this hospitality. So, from the Sufi point of view, hospitality is very important. It's interesting that you mentioned the radical. You were talking about where radical come from. But you didn't talk about where hospitality comes from. See, there is a relationship between the hospital and the hospitality. And the way the Sufis look at things is very much like the illnesses in our body is our guests. So we don't think that they're bad for you. They're actually the guests of our house for a time being. So we show them the hospitality as much as we can, and then hopefully we say goodbye to them.
Wow. That's fascinating. I do know that the term hospital is part of that. And hospital historically came from these notions of hospitality. I mean, in the Western world, and at least in the Christian world, there's a kind of unauthorized history in which a lot of this hospitality, as you mentioned, that was offered to the stranger was done by the families or the individual houses or homes within a community. A stranger would come and they would ask for hospitality, ask for food and shelter. And the family would have to decide whether to do that and how to do it. And then at some point, the institution of the church kind of stepped in and said, you know what? You don't have to do this anymore. when the stranger comes to the community, when they show up at your door, just send them to us. Just send them to the church, and we'll give them what they need. And so this did a number of things, but the two most obvious ones, I think, are that the family, the individuals in the family and the community on a grassroots level slowly ended up losing their ability, their unique kind of familial or personal ability to host the stranger. And at the same time, of course, the church used this as a way to try to convert the stranger.
Right.
And so I'm curious if there's anything in that realm that you see in the Islamic world, maybe in the Sufi world. You mentioned that since the imposition of modernity and the Industrial Revolution in the world, we see less and less possibilities for small-scale grassroots hospitality between people, in part because there's so much movement, and of course because the hospital has its brothers and sisters in the sense of the hotel and the hostel.
Absolutely.
And other things. So I'm curious if there's anything like that comes to mind for you in regards to the Islamic world.
Well, one thing is about like the Ottomans. The Ottomans, when they were coming from the Anatolia and then started conquering all those places in the Balkan area, Greece and Bulgaria and Hungary and all those places, after they actually conquer, they sent Sufis to those places. And like in Hungary, there is a person, his name is Gül Baba, which means rose father, what they call him. He actually has his own tekke. Tekke is like a church for Sufis. And this place, it's like a school, more like a school, but it's a religious school. And in this tekke, he actually finds all those people with needs, and he pretty much helped them out with all those needs. And the people coming from different religion, they actually started liking people, like from the Turks' point of view, because the Turks were symbolized by this Sufi movement. And instead of pushing people to convert or demolishing the churches and rebuilding mosques and stuff, instead of that, they actually welcome people from all over the world or all over the place, basically, to stay in the tekke, to eat and to get education in the tekke. So this was a great strategy of Ottomans. That's how they actually stayed in Europe for almost like 600 years. So that was very much like, their strategy, I think, and in a good way.
Yeah. In my research, I found out that there's still Sufi orders in the Balkans, a group called the Bektashi.
Right.
And of course, with the very little historical understanding that I had, I was very surprised. I had no idea. But of course, when I eventually went to visit the regions that my father is from, I saw churches, synagogues, and mosques all in the same little neighborhoods. So quite an impressive kind of understanding that the major religions in those places could coexist for so long. And that in the context of someone who grew up in North America, who thought it was the opposite, and such things are so difficult.
Right.
So Kerim, a mutual friend of ours has told me that in the Turkish language, there is a phrase, and excuse my pronunciation, the phrase is Tanri, misafiri,
Right.
which translates into English as something like God's guest,
Right.
or the guest sent by God.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you could speak about this phrase, maybe what it means to you and where you think it comes from.
Well, in Anatolia, it's a very famous phrase. And like I said previously, anybody coming from somewhere else who comes into somebody's house is allowed to stay in the house as the guest of God, because we believe that God has sent that guest to us.
Mm.
And we try to, it's more like making that guest happy means making God happy. So
Mm.
that's the understanding of older generation. In today's metropolitan areas, I don't think it's possible because of the security problems and everything. But like I said, in the countryside, people are very welcoming when it comes to these, because it is very important that knowing that person is actually coming from God, from Allah. So we have to take care of that person as much as possible to please God, actually. So that's
Mm.
how it is. I still see that in many cities in the more like eastern side of Turkey or south side of Turkey or even north side of Turkey, except in the bigger cities. But in the smaller cities, people are much more welcoming. Again, because of this specific idiom, actually.
From Tanri, misafiri.
Right.
Yeah.
Tanri means God in our language, in the original Turkish language, it's Tanri. And misafir means the guest.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Absolutely.
And so when guests arrive in a home, in English, at least in the context of the older traditions, it is said that the guest or the potential guest, the stranger, asks for hospitality. They don't necessarily say they ask for food, which we can imagine that surely they do. They don't necessarily say that they ask for shelter or accommodation, which we could imagine they do. But the literature often says they ask for hospitality. And so when we think of hospitality today, we often think about people sitting around a table eating food together. And so I'm curious if there's a shared understanding among Sufis, or at least the community that you live among and in, about the importance of both eating food and eating food together.
Togetherness is probably one of the most important things in the Islamic religion, because, like, even our way of worshiping God, Allah, we try to do that in a union as much as possible.
Mm.
It is very interesting. The word religion comes from. Re means again, again, and legion means union. So it's almost like religion itself means to recreate the union, to reshape the union, to have the union back, because we have the
Mm.
tendency to be alone. And even you can imagine that in the Western countries, in the Western world, a lot of people want to be alone. Like there's a lot of individuals rather than a group of people. And in the Eastern world, it's a little bit different. We are more like family oriented people. We try to do things together. I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages, obviously, but there is a difference between them. So we always have this, the more is better, basically. More people is better. So we help each other, we understand each other, we talk about our problems. When we try to solve them, it's easier together. And if there's pain, the pain is actually can be eased with more people easier, I think, compared to have this pain alone. So again, we're more family oriented people. And the Sufis are very much like that. The Sufis always pray together, and they think that it creates an energy, basically, produces an energy that basically helps all of them at the same time in a union.
Mm. Mm. And do you find that sitting down for a meal together also creates that kind of union, or recreates, as you were saying?
I think so. Doing any kind of activities, including eating. Eating is basically the most common activity that we do in our daily life. And getting together and talk about our things together and discuss things together, all those things. Togetherness, when it comes to the idea of togetherness, is I think beautiful.
Amen. Yeah, very much agree with that, Karim. And so when we think about hospitality and we think about food, we often imagine big banquet tables and, as you said, this sense of togetherness and celebration. But there's also, from what little I've read, there's also this important aspect of the religious life in the Islamic world, perhaps in the Sufi world as well, that points to maybe not the absence of food, but a different way of being fed and a different way of feeding that doesn't include the food we're used to, the kind of material food. And we often refer to this as fasting. And so there's a beautiful video that you sent me, Karim, of your mother speaking. And she recalls a phrase in that video from her own mother, who said that when we welcome suffering, we make honey out of pain. And so this is a question I very much want to ask you because I've fasted myself quite intensely. I'm curious, what is the honey that comes from fasting? Or what do you think is the honey that comes from fasting?
Right. First of all, yeah, fasting is in our religion. So we basically do that 1 month in the whole year. It's called Ramadan. In some cases, we actually do that because our Prophet Muhammad, when he lived, he was fasting every Monday and every Thursday. So it was like a common practice for some of the religious people. And at least we do that 1 month in the whole year. And obviously that month is a little bit difficult, because we not only stop eating, we also stop drinking and all that stuff. In theory, we should not be lying. We should not be telling bad things to other people or gossiping and all that stuff. But usually we do during that time. I mean, in theory, we should not be doing that. So it's like a whole discipline thing, the whole fasting. And at the end of the 30 days, you become a really, really different person. And you basically, first of all, one thing that I feel, you understand the people who do not have food. We still have people in the world, unfortunately, in Africa, or all those places, the people having less access to food as we do. And we feel like, oh yeah, we don't actually thank God for all those things that He is giving to us. And this is the time that you start thinking about the reality and start thanking God for actually giving us all that food 24 hours, 7 days. And when you're fasting during that time, you're understanding the feeling of these people who are like poor and who cannot eat. There are people now in the social media, we're seeing people who never had chocolates in their life. The people living in these countries or in the cities or metropolitan cities, we never think about these things. So we take these things granted, and during that time of fasting, you start thinking about these stuff, and then you become more thankful. And that's basically honey itself after the suffering. And I wouldn't say suffering because we don't suffer as much as they do, honestly. And we're just telling our egos, just stop for a day to do bad things and stop eating and all that stuff that the ego wants to have. And again, it's at the end of the 30 days, you become a new person because now you have a different mentality. Now, in the other 11 months, you still forget about these things, but again, it comes to, it's like a cycle.
Yeah. I totally agree with you that, gratitude is the honey.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I remember the fasting that I did over the course of 4 years. And I don't know if it was as intense as the fasting that happens during Ramadan, but doing that fasting and trying to feed something other than myself for a time imbued a degree of hospitality and gratitude that I don't think I had ever felt before. And it sticks to me, it sticks to my bones to this day. And it's something that, like you said, I also have to constantly remind myself of those moments when I sit down to eat a meal, because it's so easy to forget.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing is basically during that time of fasting, you're basically stop feeding your ego, start feeding your spirit, basically. That's what I think.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I absolutely understand that. Thank you, Karim. So my next question is around the word submission. So translated into English, the word Islam means submission. Now, I've read that this word can also be translated to mean servants of God. Servants of God. Now, in English, the word servant can be synonymous with host, a servant and a host. Now, there's a book by an author named Mona Siddiqui called Hospitality in Islam. And in that book, she writes, it's actually a quote, but she writes, "What is faith?" The Prophet replied, "The giving of food and the exchange of greetings." He ends on a most dramatic note saying, quote, "A house which is not entered by guests is not entered by angels."
Perfect. Yeah.
And it seems that in this phrase, the Prophet is suggesting that the way we are with guests and strangers has something to do with how we are with the divine, which I think you kind of alluded to a little bit earlier. And so I'm curious, is this something that you've seen in your own days or in those of others that you know? Is hospitality a practice that connects us to the divine?
Absolutely. Because reaching God, you need to reach people first. To be able to reach God, when I say reach God, meaning be in communication with Him, is basically being in a communication with the people He created. So to serve the people is basically serving Him from the Islamic point of view. So, and that's an hadith that you mentioned in the book. It's a hadith of Prophet Muhammad, like you said. And Prophet Muhammad always, it was a common practice that he was hosting maybe, 10, 15 people every night. And he's a poor person, by the way. I mean, he doesn't have much money, much food or anything, but they share. There was a time that there's a story that somebody, actually one of his apostles, rather, asks him to visit him for a dinner. So he invites him to a dinner. But during his conversation, Prophet Muhammad said, "Can I bring my friends too?" And the apostle says, "Of course, you can bring your friends." And he brings hundreds of people. Now,
Wow.
the host only have some bread and maybe a little bit meat and a little bit rice in the cup. So he was ashamed because he doesn't have any money, and the Prophet Muhammad is going to bring all those guests together, and he didn't know what to do. But he uses submission, basically. He said, well, if Prophet Muhammad is coming, then something is going to happen. And as he was thinking all those stuff, Prophet Muhammad puts his hand on top of the rice holder. And every time he was putting rice onto the dishes, the rice never ends. The meat never ends. So he served like 200 people during this invitation, and the food never ended. So he was happy for his submission, basically.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you, Kerim.
Of course.
You know, you have this beautiful book that is still in the mail, unfortunately. I haven't got my hands on it yet, but I'm very much looking forward to it, called Stories from the 30 Birds, which I understand is inspired by the Conference of the Birds, this incredible book from, I think, the 1300s.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Right.
curious if you could tell us a little bit about that book and what, if any, inspiration or maybe teachings around hospitality that come from both the Conference of the Birds and how you've employed it in your book.
Right. The Conference of the Birds, really a beautiful story of Ferideddin Attar, who lived in Nishabur, which is in Khorasan in Iran today. And he was one of the very famous Sufis at that time. He was the teacher of Rumi. A lot of people know Rumi. And he wrote this book about birds, millions of birds. They are in the process of going to their king, which is the phoenix, or we call it Simurg. And during that time, during that travel, they go through 7 valleys. And in each valley, some of the birds get lost because the valleys actually symbolize things like the first valley is the valley of intention. So a lot of birds actually don't have the intention to reach their king. The king is basically symbolizing Allah, God, and the birds are symbolizing us very much. And we are getting lost during the time of, like, our intention is basically this world. If our intention is staying in this world, then we stay in this world. And that's the valley of intention. And a lot of birds, like half of them, actually get lost in this stage. And the second valley is the valley of love. And the birds get lost in this valley are the ones that actually think the beauty is in this world, rather than they don't see the beauty of God himself. So they see the shadow of that beauty in the world, but they're content with that beauty and they don't really want to move on. And again, the third valley is the valley of wisdom. And the birds, they get lost in this valley are the ones they think the knowledge in this world is more important than anything else. And they don't realize the source of the knowledge is actually their king. So on and so forth. They go through the 7 valleys, and at the end of the 7th valley, only 30 birds remain. And the 30 birds, they are ready to see their king, and they go through this mountain called Kaf, where the Simurg, the phoenix, actually lives behind the mountain. And it's very difficult to get there, basically. When they get there, they can't find the king over there. They only find a mirror. So they realize the king is themselves, but the union of 30 birds. So Simurg, the phoenix in Iranian, in Persian, means 30 birds, actually. Si is 30. Murg is a bird, actually. So from what we understand is the union of ourselves. What we're seeing is our reflection, because the king is actually a perfect mirror. But we don't see ourselves only, we see the union of 30 birds together. So there are birds that we don't think live together. For instance, a hawk doesn't live with a smaller bird together. But in this union, they live together. They're in one. And they use whatever advantage they have together. So it's almost like being one and using the characteristics of every single bird itself.
And I imagine that someone growing up in a culture like that, whether back then or more recently, and hearing this story or hearing it multiple times, throughout their life or maybe once a year, that notion also might arise in the way that they are with others, the way they are with strangers.
Right.
And so I have one final question for you, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
So before we say farewell, I'd like to ask you about Istanbul. And I'd like to ask you about the limits to hospitality. So last year, on a trip I took to the city, I met a friend of a mutual friend of ours. And for a couple of hours, we walked around the Karakoy neighborhood. And he spoke to me about how the city has changed quite a bit over the last decade. For many people who grew up in Istanbul, the city might now appear to be very difficult to live in. He said that the cost of living has skyrocketed. The rent prices or costs have doubled. And much of this is a combination of tourism and gentrification in the city. Now, it seems that many religious traditions speak of the importance of welcoming strangers and offering them hospitality, but they also speak of the limits to such hospitality. In one particular hadith or saying of the Prophet, it is said that hospitality is for 3 days. Anything more is charity or sadaqah. Again, excuse my pronunciation.
No, that's perfect pronunciation.
And so I'm curious, you mentioned a little bit earlier in the Sufi community and perhaps in the Islamic communities, there is this notion of togetherness, but also that more is better. And so I'm curious in the context of what's happening in Istanbul and what's happening in many places around the world, do you think there should also be limits to the hospitality that is offered to the guest or stranger?
Well, of course. Of course, we have financial issues here, and it's very difficult for us to actually serve other people as much as we want to. But again, when we're together, even it's very difficult to live in the city, it's still something, What I see, the rent went up, like you said. So the people try to move into your family houses, the houses there of their families and everything. And in Western countries, it's difficult. You usually don't do these kind of stuff. But in our community, it's much easier to do these things. And, the families welcome the children more than other countries. So that's something I think that's a positive thing. But to the strangers, what do we do for strangers? Obviously, we do as much as possible. We may not be able to serve them as much as we used to, obviously, before this inflation. And we have the highest inflation in the world, probably the second highest inflation. So again, it's difficult. And Istanbul became probably one of the most expensive cities in the world. But even that, again, we may not be able to take them to dinner every night, but we serve what we have in the house, like the Prophet Muhammad's story. Whatever we have, we share. We call it bereka, as in Arabic, baraka, they call it. Baraka is something like we use it for money. It's not more money, that's not important. How do I say that? I don't even know how to say it in English, but it's more like the luck of the money itself. Basically, you may be able to buy more stuff with less money based on your luck. That's basically what we call it bereka. So the bereka is much more important than the amount of the money or the financial thing. And the bereka always goes up when you share it.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. In English, not to reduce it at all, but in English, we say quality over quantity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you said that in order to offer hospitality or the hospitality that we would like to offer to our guests, sometimes maybe that means not doing it all the time because one simply cannot, right? It's not possible.
Right.
But yeah, it's a really beautiful point.
Rumi is a very important Sufi probably known by many Americans, even the world knows him. He wrote a poem which is about the guests. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read that. It's called The Guest House, and it goes like, this human life is a guest house. Every dawn, a new visitor arrives. A gladness, a sadness, a pettiness, a flash of insight, all come knocking unannounced. Welcome them all, make room, even if a band of sorrows storms in and clears your rooms of comfort, still honor every guest. Perhaps they empty you to prepare you for something brighter. The gloomy thought, the shame, the bitterness, greet them at the door with a smile and lead them inside. Be thankful for whoever comes, for each is sent as a messenger from the beyond. So that's a poem by Rumi, and I think it pretty much explains the whole hospitality thing.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. Gorgeous poem. I love that. I'll make sure that's up on the End of Tourism website when the episode launches. And so finally, Kerim, I'd like to thank you so very much for being willing to join me today, to being willing to speak in a language that is not your first or mother tongue, and to share with us some of the beauty that has touched your days. Before we say goodbye, perhaps you could tell our listeners how they can follow and learn more about Kerim Vakfi, Stories from the 30 Birds, your book, and any other projects you might want them to know about.
Inshallah. We have a Sufi center in North Carolina, University of North Carolina. We have a center in China, Beijing University, and another center in Kyoto University in Japan. And my mother's book about the commentary of some Quranic verses is the one. For instance, Yasin is available on the Amazon. And my book with 30 Birds is available on Barnes & Noble and all that other places in US.
Beautiful. Well, I'll make sure that those links are all available on the End of Tourism website and on my Substack when the episode comes out. And on behalf of our listeners, Kerim, teşekkür.
Estağfurullah. I thank you.
Thank you for listening. To follow up on this episode, check out the homework section on our website at theendoftourism.com. Likewise, you can subscribe and join the conversation at chrischristou.substack.com. That's CHRISCHRISTOU.substack.com. The pod embraces a gift economy model, and by signing up, spreading the word, and supporting us financially, we can ensure that this work continues in a good way. Until next time, farewell, friends.